August 1943. 24,000 feet over Belgium. The world is all glare and engine noise and the thin, metallic taste of oxygen. Lieutenant Jack Morrison feels the trouble before he sees it. A sick shudder runs through the airframe, a deep vibration in the rudder pedals. His left Allison V1710 coughs once, twice, and dies. The oil pressure needle slams to zero. Out the left window, the big propeller windmills uselessly, a silver blur fighting dead weight. The lightning jerks as asymmetric thrust bites. The nose yaws, the right engine clawing them into a tightening, lethal turn. Before he can run a checklist, the radio explodes in his ears. Bandits, high 6! 8 plus! 8 plus! He cranes his neck. Black crosses dropping out of the sun. 8 BF 109 Js in a shallow dive, closing fast. Every P-38 pilot knows the math. 2 engines, you fight. 1 engine, you jump. A single engine lightning is a spinning coffin. Uncontrollable yaw. Roll you can't stop. A flat spin that tears the tail off. The manual is blunt bailout. His squadron mates, scattered above, are already expecting to see a white blossom of silk. Morrison's hand goes to the harness buckle and hesitates. He's not thinking about the manual. He's thinking about torque curves, drag, airflow. The Georgia grease monkey who rebuilt his first engine at 14, staring at a different kind of problem. 8 Messerschmitts are diving on a dead man. The manual said a single-engine P-38 was unflyable. Jack Morrison was about to prove the manual didn't know everything. What Morrison did next wasn't about nerves of steel or superhuman reflexes. It was about how deeply he understood the machine trying to kill him. Most pilots learned the P-38 from the cockpit forward, procedures, checklists, emergency drills. You memorized the manual, you trusted the engineers, and when something failed outside the book, you grabbed the handles and prayed your parachute opened. Morrison came at it from the other direction. Before he was Lieutenant Morrison, 357th Fighter Group, he was just Jack from Georgia, the kid who tore down junkyard engines to see what failed first, who could hear a bad bearing in a truck idling 2 streets away. To him, the P-38 wasn't a sacred, untouchable system. It was an overbuilt, imperfect, fascinating machine with limits that could be stretched and rules that might be bent. That difference is the heart of this story. The Lightning's flight manual said a single-engine P-38 at combat power was a death trap. Morrison knew its oil system, fuel plumbing, and torque behavior well enough to see something else: a narrow, dangerous path where asymmetric thrust could be turned from a death sentence into a weapon. Jack Morrison didn't just fly the P-38, he understood it. Down to the oil pressure, the fuel flow, the weird ways the airframe twisted under power. That understanding kept him alive when the manual said he should be dead. Before Jack Morrison ever strapped into a Lightning, he'd lived most of his life elbow-deep in machinery. He grew up in a lean corner of rural Georgia, in a cinderblock repair shop that smelled of hot oil and welding smoke. His father fixed whatever rolled, crawled, or limped through the door: farm tractors, pulpwood trucks, church buses held together with baling wire and prayer. Jack was sweeping floors before he could read, handing wrenches before he could see over a fender. By 14, he'd rebuilt his first car engine on a dirt driveway, laying parts out on an old bedsheet so the gravel wouldn't swallow them. By 18, farmers would detour 10 extra miles to let the Morrison boy listen to it. He could tell a cracked ring or a bad bearing from a few seconds of idle. When the war came, he enlisted as an aircraft mechanic and found himself in Texas, crawling through the cramped guts of P-38s. For 18 months, he lived inside Allison V1710s, safety wiring fittings, chasing oil leaks, learning exactly how the turbochargers spooled up, and how fast an abused engine cooked its oil. Most pilots first met the P-38 from the cockpit, through manuals, check rides, and instructors' stories. Morrison met it from underneath, staring up at drip pans and exhaust stacks. He knew how fuel really flowed through the system, which gauges lied first, what a misbehaving turbo sounded like 3 days before it failed. When he finally won a slot in pilot training and came back to the Lightning with silver wings, he brought that knowledge with him. After missions, while other pilots headed for coffee or cards, Morrison drifted to the line, trading jokes and questions with the ground crews, studying what had broken and why. The crew chief said, "He's one of us." The other pilot said, "Morrison's a little strange." Morrison's own verdict was simple. Most pilots trusted the manual. I trusted the machine. The machine always told you more than the manual, if you listened. From the ground, the P-38 Lightning looked like something from the future: twin booms, twin engines, a long central nacelle bristling with cannon and machine guns. It climbed like a homesick angel, cruised farther than almost any other Allied fighter, and could hit hard from well outside rifle range. German pilots learned to fear it early. They gave it a name that stuck: Der Geballschwanz-Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. But the men who flew it knew the devil had teeth pointed inward too. The first problem was compressibility. Push a Lightning into a steep dive, and past a certain speed, the airflow over its thick wings went transonic. Shock waves formed. The nose tucked under. Control forces spiked until the yoke might as well have been welded in place. In 1943, compressibility was a half-understood word in engineering memos, not a solved problem. To a pilot, it meant one thing: you pull, nothing happens, and the countryside comes up like a fist. The second problem was quieter, and more relevant to Jack Morrison's day over Belgium. On paper, the P-38 was a safe twin: lose an engine, fly home on the other. In practice, those engines sat way out on the wings, far from the center line. At combat power, if one quit, the live engine's thrust acted through a long lever arm. The airplane didn't just yaw, it twisted hard. The dead engine's propeller, still windmilling, became a giant drag disc, pulling that wing back while the other surged ahead. At the high speeds and power settings of air combat, the yawing force could exceed what the rudder could counter. Below a certain speed, VMC minimum control speed, the Lightning could simply roll over its back and depart controlled flight. Many did. Pilots who tried to save a single-engine P-38 at full power often rode it into a spin they never recovered from. By mid-1943, internal USAF tallies showed a sobering pattern. A significant slice of P-38 losses weren't from flak or fighters, but from accidents, dives gone wrong, engine failures followed by loss of control. The unofficial doctrine: hardened lose an engine in combat. You don't try to be a hero, you get out. Into that reputation, Jack Morrison flew. Morrison's luck over Belgium wasn't luck at all. It was the result of a private test program he'd been running ever since he first got his hands on a P-38. He started where the manual stopped. In high-altitude training flights, safely above home base, he'd pull the mixture on one engine and feel what the airplane wanted to do. Full power on the live engine, bad idea. The Lightning would yaw and roll so hard it felt like it wanted to swap ends, so he began to experiment. First came asymmetric drag management. Instead of fighting the yaw with brute leg power, he brought the live engine back, way back, until the thrust just barely exceeded the drag of the dead side. At that setting, the airplane stopped trying to cartwheel and started to fly again. Add a whisper of bank into the good engine, a touch of rudder, and the Lightning settled into a crooked but controllable groove. There was, he realized, a flyable envelope nobody talked about, hidden between both engines, and bail out. Then he pushed further. He knew from the shop that a dead Allison wasn't always dead. Sometimes it had just lost fuel or oil pressure momentarily. At the right airspeed, a windmilling prop would spin the engine fast enough to drive the pumps and magnetos. So he worked out his own air restart routine, stabilized the aircraft on the good engine at minimum useful power, let the airflow turn the dead prop, crack the throttle, reintroduce fuel and ignition, and, often enough, the engine would cough, catch, and come back. On a few hair-raising occasions, he even swapped engines in flight, idling or briefly cutting the good engine to kill the worst of the yaw while he tried to coax life back into the other. No manual suggested shutting down your only working power plant, but Morrison understood the Allison's internals well enough to know how long he had before temperatures and oil film became a problem. He also learned to play the fuel system. By feeding both engines from one side, then switching, he could shift fuel mass and trim out some of the Lightning's lateral imbalance. Tiny advantages, but they added up. To Morrison, this wasn't daredevilry. It was cooperation. Every machine wants to work, he said later. Your job is to help it remember how. At 24,000 feet over Belgium, Morrison feels the left engine seize and the Lightning lurch. 8 black specks above swell into Messerschmitts, angle of attack increasing as they roll into their dive. He doesn't swear, doesn't yell. His voice on the intercom is flat. Left's gone. Staying with it. Right, throttle comes back. Way back. Left mixture is already cut. The P-38 stops trying to flip on its back and settles into a crabbed, nosy low attitude. He feeds in rudder, a touch of opposite aileron, then starts trimming like a madman, chasing out the worst of the forces until the yoke stops, trying to wrench itself out of his hands. The Germans expect a falling target. A Lightning with one engine smoking should roll over and corkscrew down, helpless. Instead, the cripple holds a rough formation turn, bleeding altitude deliberately, not tumbling. Morrison lets them close, then shoves the nose further down. The good engine comes up just enough to keep the airspeed in his known safe band. Fast enough for control, slow enough to stay clear of compressibility. The Lightning claws into a descending spiral, presenting no easy, straight line of fire. The leader commits. He dives past Morrison's high 6, anticipating a simple tracking shot on a dying twin. Morrison has seen this movie, in training, with one engine pulled. He kicks rudder, snaps a shallow bank into the live engine, and the P-38 slithers sideways across the German's projected path. For one brief moment, the nose swings through the Bf-109's flight line. He doesn't wait for perfection. He squeezes. 120 memory of cannon and 450 cals spit a converging stream. The leader's Messerschmitt comes apart in a flash and a tumble of debris. The Lightning was hit. We saw the engine smoking. It should have fallen, but it turned on us. One German pilot would later recall. We didn't understand. The formation breaks. No one is eager to press and close on a wounded animal that just killed their ace. Alone now, Morrison points his crooked Lightning west. He trems, fiddles with fuel crossfeed to keep the wings level, keeps the right engine at the lowest power that will hold altitude. Every few minutes he noses down to cool it, listening for the faintest change in pitch. He crosses the channel low, ready to glide. He rolls onto an emergency field with 5 minutes of fuel in the tanks and sweat freezing in the small of his back. Ground crews count 17 holes in the airframe. Morrison just walks around the Lightning once, hand on the metal, already thinking about what the machine just taught him. Word about the Belgium fight spread faster than the official report. In the squadron-ready room, Morrison didn't talk about heroics. He drew diagrams. On a chalkboard scrounged from base supply, he sketched a top view of the P-38, marked thrust lines, drag vectors, and the moment arm of those far-out engines. Then he wrote 3 numbers: airspeed, power setting, bank angle. This is where it doesn't try to kill you. He told the other pilots, stay here, you can fly it. At first it was unofficial, a handful of Lightning drivers staying late, running, Morrison drills. At altitude pull an engine, find the sweet spot, practice air restarts. Ground crews, who already trusted him as one of their own, quietly reinforced the message. Lieutenant Morrison knows these Allisons, one crew chief would say. If he says it'll restart, believe him. Not everyone was convinced. Some senior officers saw only risk and regulation. The book said bail out. Morrison's methods sounded like tempting fate, but sorties kept coming back on one engine. Pilots, who should have punched out, limped home, instead, grinning, still wired from the effort of keeping the Lightning in that narrow, crabbed envelope he'd described. Numbers are hard to argue with by mid-1944. Internal analysis showed engine-related P-38 losses down by roughly 30% in units that had adopted Morrison's techniques. Hundreds of aircrew who walked away from landings they were never supposed to make. The ad hoc chalk talks turned into briefed procedures. Training squadrons started mentioning controlled single-engine profiles and air restart techniques that looked a lot like Morrison's notes. One fellow pilot summed it up later. Morrison saved more lives with a chalkboard than most aces did with their guns. Morrison finished his first combat tour with a respectable handful of victories. But no one mistook him for a glory hunter. When his ticket home came up, he signed the paper to stay. Not to chase more kills. To train. By then, the 357th was filling with fresh faces, kids with barely 2 years between high school desks and high-altitude dogfights. Morrison moved naturally into the role of teacher, riding shotgun on checkout flights, drilling emergency procedures, insisting they understand what the gauges meant, not just where the needles should point. When he finally did rotate stateside, the Air Forces sent him to Randolph Field. There, in hot Texas air a long way from Belgium, he poured everything he'd learned into wave after wave of new pilots. An estimated 430 by war's end. His briefings were different. Where others said, "Do this, then that," Morrison said, "Here's why." He drew cross-sections of engines, sketched fuel lines and oil galleries, walked students through how failures started and how they sounded and felt before the gauges caught up. Years later, his former students would write that he'd saved their lives, not by yanking them out of burning wrecks, but by putting the right picture in their heads before something went wrong. His influence didn't stop with them. His son flew helicopters in Vietnam and rode out a power loss over the jungle by treating it as a problem to be solved, not a panic. His great-grandson flies F-22s today, raised on the same quiet creed of mechanical respect. After the war, Jack Morrison went home to Georgia, back to a small shop in honest Greece. He turned down interviews, shrugged off commendations. "I didn't do anything special," he'd say. "I just listened to the machine." Jack Morrison's fingerprints are still on modern cockpits. Test pilots and weapons. School graduates study the same principles he uncovered: how to manage asymmetric thrust, how to probe the edges of an aircraft's envelope without crossing them, how to treat a cascading emergency as a solvable engineering problem instead of a verdict. His story distills a few hard truths. Deep system knowledge buys you margins of survival no checklist can. Manuals describe how things should work. Real understanding is what you lean on when they don't. The most lasting victories often come from teaching, not tallying kills. Today's fighter pilots still chase hidden performance at the margins. Morrison showed what it looks like when you find it. High over Belgium, with one prop a useless blur and 8 Messerschmitts closing in, it looked, for everyone watching, like the end of the story. A crippled lightning, a dead engine, a sky full of enemies. But the airplane wasn't dying. It was waiting. Waiting for someone who knew how the oil flowed, how the torque twisted the airframe, how far you could lean on an Allison before it gave up. Waiting for the Georgia mechanic who understood that beneath the noise and fear and shredded metal, the P-38 still wanted to fly. After the war, Jack Morrison went back to that same language of wrenches and bearings in a small Georgia shop. He rarely spoke about the missions, never boasted about the 14 victory marks on his old Lightning. What mattered were the pilots who came home because of a lesson, a diagram, a sentence he'd left in their heads. Jack Morrison's greatest victory wasn't the German ace he shot down over Belgium. It was the 430 pilots who lived because a Georgia mechanic understood something the manuals didn't. Every machine wants to work. Your job is to help it remember how. A P-38 sits silent on a museum floor, polished and still. Somewhere else, an F-22's engines spool up to a rising whine. The lineage holds.